two of three parts for this chapter. In this section, we're going to be talking about now the female reproductive system, the reproductive organs, external genitalia, ovarian cycle for non-pregnant ovarian cycle, estrogen and progesterone, the uterine cycle for the non-pregnant, and then also fertilization and pregnancy. So first, start off like we did with the male reproductive system and take a look at the organs that are listed in table 16.2 and on the next slide here, and their illustration on page 367 in your textbook. The female gonads are actually paired ovaries, and they are located in the pelvic cavity. The ovaries actually produce eggs. They're also called ova, or singularly it's called ovum. And this is that slide in your textbook. So the uterine tubes, they have a couple different names here. Uterine tubes or oviducts or fallopian tubes. The tubes actually conduct the eggs and location. It's the location of fertilization as well. The uterus, also called the womb, houses the developing fetus. And the cervix is part of the womb or the uterus, and it contains that opening to the uterus. And then the vagina, which receives the penis during sexual intercourse, and also serves as the birth canal and an exit for menstrual blood flow. So we'll take a look at the organs called fallopian tubes, or also called oviducts, and they extend from the uterus to the ovaries. Now, interestingly, the ovaries, the tube doesn't actually attach to the ovaries. Instead, they have these little finger-like projections called fimbriae that sweep over the ovaries. So when the egg is ejected from the ovary, this happens every month, typically during ovulation, it is moved into the uterus by this fimbriae motion and the cilia movement along the fallopian tubes. So it's taking the egg from the ovary, getting it into the fallopian tubes, or the oviducts, if you will, into the uterus eventually. And the egg, if it's not fertilized, only has a short lifespan. I mean, very short. It's either somewhere between 6 hours or up to 24 hours. So within a day is only its lifespan if it's not fertilized. And this is the illustration in your textbook where you can see we're looking at the ovary here in the abdominal cavity, and this uterine tube or oviduct with this little fimbriae, these little finger-like projections. And here's another example over here on the right side of that slide where this fimbriae or finger-like projections don't actually connect, but they move over the ovary. So the movement of the egg or ovum would be through this uterine tube, fallopian tube, or oviduct into the uterus. Back in here, this is the uterus, and it has this tilt into, and the cervix is the bottom portion of the uterus as it enters into the vagina. So the uterus is a thick-walled, muscular organ. The uterine tubes again join at the uterus at its upper end, and as we just pointed out, the cervix is at the lower end of the uterus. And if you noted back on that picture, the cervix enters the vagina at nearly a right angle. It's not straight down, it's actually at a right angle. The development of the fetus normally takes place in the uterus, and the uterus is normally about 5 centimeters wide, but it can stretch to over 30 centimeters wide, obviously for the growing fetus. And inside the uterus, there's a special lining called the endometrium. The endometrium actually supplies nutrients for fetal development. It also helps to participate in the development or formation of the placenta. The endometrium actually has two layers. The first is shed each month during a menstrual period, and then that second layer underneath is the basal layer, and it has the reproducing cells. And you can see on page 371 the endometrial layer. If you look at that slide, it fluctuates in thickness throughout the month, and we'll take a closer look at that here in a moment. So in the opening, in the organs, the small opening in the cervix, that's the base of the uterus, leads to the vaginal canal. Now in the vagina there's a mucosal lining, and it has folds that can extend during sexual intercourse and then of course through during a pregnancy and again during birth. The vagina also acts as an exit for menstrual flow, and usually monthly, if the egg isn't fertilized. So now in the vagina there's several types of bacteria that normally reside in the vagina. This is normal, and it actually makes the pH environment in the vagina a little bit more acidic. And the reason the bacteria produce this more acidic environment is actually to protect the vagina from pathogenic type bacteria. So this is a good thing for the health of in that environment. I'm going to take a look at page 367 on figure 16.7. This is the illustration of the external female genitalia. So far we're talking about internal. This is external. And these organs or areas are collectively called the vulva. And there's two different folds of skin. The outer fold is called labia majora, and the inner fold is labia minora. And the inner, or the labia minora, extends forward from openings of the urethra and the vagina, and forward to encircle and form actually a foreskin for the glans clitoris. And you can see that in the illustration on page 367, figure 16.7. I want to take a look at the ovarian cycle, if not pregnant. So the ovary has many follicles, and each one has an immature egg called an oocyte. That's correct, oocyte. Yes. Females are born with 2 million follicles. That would be a lot of babies for one person. However, at the time of puberty, there are only 300 to 400,000 follicles, immature potential eggs, if you will. However, of those, there's only a small number, maybe only 400 that ever mature, because females usually produce only one egg per month during their reproductive years. So that's quite a difference. 2 million possibilities down to maybe 400 in a lifetime, to maybe only most people less than 10 children in their lifetime. But anyways, the follicle matures during the ovarian cycle, and I want you to look at page 370 and figure 16.6. 16.8, and follow these steps here. What happens is the primary follicle has this oocyte. Now, if you follow the pictures and understand these steps, the whole process will make a lot more sense here. So that primary follicle has this oocyte that begins to produce the estrogen hormone. There's a secondary follicle. It contains a secondary oocyte, and it produces estrogen and some progesterone. There's a vesicular or Graafian follicle, and that actually develops around that oocyte. So during ovulation in step 4, you can see where the secondary oocyte is released. You see how it's expelled there. And what's left is number 5, which is this corpus luteum. You hear about luteal phase and some of these graphs coming up. We're talking about this corpus luteum, which produces progesterone and some estrogens, and then it degenerates. This is in a non-fertilized situation. So oogenesis, how are eggs developed? Just as we talked about how a sperm developed, how are these eggs developed? Well, the primary oocyte has 46 chromosomes, and it undergoes this process we just described of meiosis. And there's 2 steps. The meiosis 1 is a haploid cell. It does have half the number, or 23 chromosomes, and this polar body. And the polar body they describe as sort of a trash can out there. It actually holds discarded chromosomes. And then it goes into the next step, which is meiosis 2. Now, meiosis 2 only happens if it's fertilized by a sperm cell. Then it becomes the zygote. But if no fertilization occurs, then the oocyte will die, typically in 6 to 24 hours. So this is that slide or illustration in your book. We talk about the primary oocyte. We have the first meiosis, and we have the first polar body. And then if we have, we have the first polar body, we have the primary or secondary oocytes. Here's the primary oocyte, 46 chromosomes. Then we go through meiosis, so now we have the secondary oocyte, which is half the number, so we have 23 chromosomes, and there's that polar body trash can out there. If there's fertilization by the sperm cell, you go on to meiosis 2, and then you have a zygote. So we go on to the phases of the ovarian cycle. It's quite the orchestration going on here in the female body and the male body as well, with the hormones and the production of different follicles. So here the ovarian follicle produces, it keeps producing levels of estrogen, and it causes the endometrium, which is the lining inside the uterus, to continue to thicken. After ovulation, when it's released, that egg cell is released, that corpus luteum produces increasing levels of progesterone. And with no fertilization, the progesterone declines and the endometrial lining breaks down because there's no fertilization. Don't need to build up that tissue inside the uterus, so it's sloughed off during monthly menstruation. The luteinizing hormone triggers ovulation typically at about day 14 of a typical woman's menstrual cycle of a 28-day cycle. And so here's a table to remind you that there's a follicle phase, there's ovulation on day 14, and then there's this luteal phase. And the events where we have menstruation, this is the endometrium sloughs off, so it breaks down, and then there's the endometrium rebuilding after menstruation ends, and then we have thickening and glands in the secretory phase, waiting for fertilization. And this graph, even though as busy as it looks, it's really a great synopsis of everything that's going on in this masterful orchestration here. So if you look down this line, we've got this line here going ovulation. Oops, go back here, hit the wrong button, going straight down telling you this is where ovulation. So let's go down at the bottom. This is day, going from day 0 to day 4. Well, some menstruation lasts longer than 3 days, but say this is the menstrual period here. So this is the endometrium, the lining of the uterus. So during menstruation it's going to slough off. There's always obviously some endometrial lining. And then proliferative phase, this is where it's starting to build up again. This coincides with the follicular phase. So we have a developing follicle, an egg cell, and then a mature follicle. So this continues to build this endometrial lining. And now look, at ovulation, the egg is expelled from the ovary, and it is causing more endometrial lining to build up. So and then we have this leftover corpus luteum. So now we're into the luteal phase, if you will. Okay, and notice here hormone levels. So we have lower estrogen peaks, and we have ovulation, and then estrogen comes down again. Well, while progesterone's pretty straightforward here till we get to the luteal phase, and then it climbs. And then if no fertilization, then it starts to regress, that corpus, and then we get back into the menstrual cycle, sloughing off again. It's a great slide. So control of hormones, again, just like for males, for females, the hypothalamus produces the gonadotropin releasing hormone, and it stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce the follicle stimulating hormone and the luteinizing hormone. Now for women, the follicle stimulating hormone actually stimulates the follicle to produce primarily estrogen, whereas the luteinizing hormone stimulates the corpus luteum to produce primarily progesterone, as we just looked at in that last slide. So estrogen and progesterone, those actually also affect other parts of the body. They are also responsible for secondary sex characteristics in females. And there's a couple other hormones involved with pregnancy, and that's milk production. In the breast, it's called prolactin, and after birth of fetus milk let down in the mother's breast when the baby nurses, called oxytocin. And then of course there's menopause. This ovarian cycle has to stop sometime, and it does, and it's typically around the years of anywhere between 45 and 55 is your typical time when the ovarian cycle stops. And again, here's that same illustration like in the males. We've got the hormone being master gland up here in the hypothalamus to the anterior pituitary, releasing follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Here we're affecting the ovary, and we're looking at particularly the egg cell and the corpus luteum to produce estrogen and progesterone. Okay, well, so it's different when fertilization takes place, obviously in pregnancy. So look at page 373, and it's on figure 16.12, and we'll look on the next slide too. So once the egg and the sperm connect and become the first cell, the zygote cell, it actually travels down the fallopian tube, or uterine tubes, or oviducts, if you will, to the uterus. So fertilization usually happens in the fallopian tubes, not in the uterus. It moves to the uterus once it becomes a zygote. The endometrium obviously is thickened and ready to receive this developing or a zygote that's about to develop into an embryo. Those first cells, actually the embryo implants itself into the endometrial lining, and that gets its nutrients, it signals the beginning of pregnancy. It also starts the development of the placenta. And by the way, the placenta originates from both the embryo, that tissue, and the mother's tissue. And at first, the placenta actually produces this hormone, this very interesting hormone called the human chorionic gonadotropin hormone, or HCG. And this HCG is what the pregnancy test picks up in the blood or the urine. So if there's a placenta being developed, it produces a hormone. If one is to take a pregnancy test from the blood or the urine, it's picking up or detecting whether or not this hormone HCG is present or not. Well, guess what? If there's no placenta producing this hormone, the person's probably not pregnant. If there is a placenta producing that hormone, yes, then definitely this person is pregnant. The HCG also causes the corpus luteum to produce increasing amounts of progesterone. So progesterone then shuts down the hypothalamus and the anterior pituitary so that there's no more new follicle development. So it's going to take care of one developing fetus at a time, or twins, if you will, or triplets, but only that birthing focus at one time. And then the progesterone also maintains that uterine lining for the embryos, so that's very important for it to maintain progesterone. And this is a nice illustration again in your book. This is during the ovulation. Here's ovulation, and then we've got the zygote, and it's the luteal phase. Now progesterone, watch what happens with progesterone. It starts to climb, and during pregnancy it stays elevated. So that ends the second part of the reproductive system, female reproductive system and organs, about the external genitals, the ovarian cycle for those that are not pregnant, estrogen and progesterone, the uterine cycle for non-pregnancy, and then also fertilization and pregnancy.